talking about something called the NSPA or NSPA Code of Ethics. NSPA stands for National Scholastic Press Association. Now, if you are in Digital 2, this is probably a review for you. If you're in Digital 1, it might be the first time that you're hearing about this. But either way, this is one of the most important things that you need to know as a journalist. So, to get started, first we should probably talk about what ethics actually are. So the official definition of ethics are moral principles that govern a person's behavior. What that means in practice is basically things that you should do if you are going to be a good moral person. So a code of ethics for journalists is essentially a list of things that journalists should do to be good or ethical journalists. These are things in this class that you absolutely must do. This is different from legality. There are actually very few laws restricting what journalists can and cannot do, how they can or cannot report, and what they can or cannot publish. But, as someone very wise once said, just because you can doesn't mean you should. So we're going to be talking about the should part today, because the should in this class is going to be the can. The should is required. Be responsible. What does this look like for a journalist, though? As a journalist, your job is to use journalism to spread truth and help people. That is a journalist's primary function. While you should not only report on the positive, you want to keep your motivations in check. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Your goal as a journalist is to spread truth and get information that people need to know to those people at any cost. And oftentimes, truth is ugly. Truth is not always going to make the subject of your story look good. Truth in scholastic journalism is not always going to make your school look good. However, truth does need to be your motivation always. Don't go chasing a story specifically because it doesn't make someone look good or specifically because it's controversial. You don't want to force an agenda that's not there. That's not responsible. Also, it's not about you as a reporter. You need to try and keep yourself out of the story as much as possible, especially when reporting on things like news. It's really easy to get caught up in the power of anything. And as a reporter, you might start to feel pretty powerful because you're the one who's reporting on information that people need to know, and you might be the only way that people are going to get that information. However, ultimately, what you need to remember is that the story is not about you. Your job as a reporter is to relay information that already exists. Also, this one's really important, especially for school journalism, is you need to disclose conflicts of interest if they're unavoidable. We'll talk more about what that means later, but basically a conflict of interest means if you are a part of a group or an activity, or you have a personal stake in something, and you are reporting on that, that's a conflict of interest because you're not going to be able to remain objective about what you're reporting on. So anytime you have a conflict of interest that you can't avoid, you need to disclose that in your story. But whenever possible, you just want to avoid those. And again, we will talk about those later. Also, hold those in power accountable. That's a huge job that journalists have. You need to stand up for your journalism if it's challenged. Remember that your job as a journalist is to report on the truth and to bring truth and information that people need into the public's hands. So, a big part of that is making sure that you are the thing standing between those in power and corruption. Sometimes the justice system or the systems that are in place do not work. Just look at the Me Too movement, for example. The Me Too movement, which is a movement in which a lot of women have started to come forward, specifically in the media and entertainment industries, and talk about men who have sexually assaulted or sexually harassed them, that came about because of journalism. And the reason that became a movement in journalism is because the justice system was not holding those men accountable. That's your job as a journalist. Where other systems fail to hold accountability, you need to hold people accountable with your reporting. If anybody tries to shut down your reporting because they're in a position of power and you are trying to hold them accountable, you need to stand up for it. It's your job to defend what you know is true. Also, having a right to say something doesn't make it right to say it. So that's also something to keep in mind because you need to think about the consequences of your story before publishing it. Know when to show restraint, especially with controversial stories. What you want to do anytime you are reporting on something controversial is you want to think about what the consequences of publishing that story will be. Hopefully, by publishing that story, you are making the world a better and more informed place. But if you're not, if you're just stirring the pot for the sake of stirring the pot, then maybe reconsider whether or not you should be reporting on that issue. Fulfill and defend yours and others' First Amendment rights. So for those of you who don't know, the First Amendment rights are freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Those are the ones that we're mainly concerned with. You have a right to that, even as a minor. Even as a teenager, you have a right to speak your mind, and you have a right to publish the things that you want to publish. Adults will try and tell you that you don't have that right because you're just a high school student, but you in fact do. And the more that you know that and the more confident you are in that fact, the harder it will be for people to shut important stories that you write down. Always act with integrity. Remember that you represent your publication. So all of the things that you do, even in your personal life now, are going to reflect on 4250. Make sure that you are treating people with fairness and make sure that you aren't spreading fake news. And also respect each other. Respect your audience and respect your interview subjects. You're not always going to portray everybody in a positive light because the truth is not always positive. However, recognize that people are people. Respect your interview subjects. Don't offend them for something stupid. That's why I tell you to ask their pronouns, why I tell you to make sure that you know how to spell their name right, that you're saying their name right, that you're respecting their time. Because ultimately, your interview subjects are your sources, and it's up to them whether or not they want to give you information or not. So remember that you always need to respect people's humanity. Next, we're going to talk about being fair. So being fair has a lot to do with something called bias. Or bias is any time your opinion or your agenda shows through in your reporting, which it should never. So you want to avoid bias first and foremost during the reporting process. A lot of people think that bias just shows up during the writing process, but it happens a lot earlier with who you choose to interview, who you choose to not interview, and what kinds of questions you choose to ask. If you're heavily biased about a topic that you're reporting on, rather than trying to ignore that bias, acknowledge it and overcorrect for it. So if you have some bias, try to compensate for that by over-investigating the side that you disagree with, because you should know that naturally you're going to ask fewer questions about something that you already agree with. So as a reporter, correct for your own shortcomings by doing double the work to investigate the side you disagree with to make sure that you really are getting the full story. Also, don't prejudge a situation based on unconfirmed information. If someone tells you that, for example, there's a student group. Let's say someone tells you that a student group is doing something wrong, and you don't have any confirmed information on that, but you do know some of your friends have experiences with this student group that are less than positive. Do not go into reporting on that story assuming that the student group is doing something wrong because of your unconfirmed information. It is okay to start a story based on information that you hear people talking about, but don't let that affect your judgment before you've done your actual thorough reporting on both sides. Also, leave your personal agenda at the door, especially when you're covering controversial issues. If you're covering a controversial issue that you have a deep personal stake in, maybe you shouldn't cover it, because ultimately it's going to be pretty much impossible for you to cover it unbiasedly. Also, judge a story's newsworthiness objectively. That goes into leaving your personal agenda at the door. An example of this would be, let's say that you have a lot of friends in the school musical. So you really, really want us to cover the school musical. We should be covering the school musical anyway, but you want like 5 stories on the school musical. Not because you think it's newsworthy, but because your friends are in it. That would be an example of having a personal agenda, and you need to leave those personal agendas out of your judgments on newsworthiness. Also, don't cover a story if you're mainly doing so for your ego or as a favor for someone else. That should be a given. Make sure that you're providing a platform for a variety of perspectives, especially those that challenge yours. That goes hand in hand with the idea of making sure that you are doing double to investigate the side that you disagree with or the side that challenges you. Ultimately, one of the great things about journalism is that it gives a voice to the voiceless. It gives a voice to people who are normally not heard. But if you're not going out of your way to interview those people, and if you're just trying to create your own echo chamber to make yourself and your own opinions feel better, then honey, you're not doing journalism. You're just not. So don't do it. Also, and this is pretty specific, only respond to letters of the editor if clarification is needed, not to get into the last word. So there are these things called letters to the editor. Our publication allows it to because we're a public forum. But readers can write in to your publication about issues that they want to talk about, or if they see that you've written an article that they have an opinion about, they might write in specifically about an article. It's unprofessional to respond to those letters officially as a publication unless you need to clarify something factual. Otherwise, it just looks like you're arguing with your readers, and that's not productive. That also goes for the comment section. So on our website, we have a comment section, and at times people may comment on your articles, and sometimes those comments might be less than favorable. Do not respond to those comments. Just don't do it. It looks really, really bad from the outside, and it's not professional. And ultimately, it's not fair because you're the reporter, you have the power over the story, you're the one who put the story out in the first place. And as a consequence of that, you have to allow people to respond to it. It's ultimately not an argument. Next up, you also want to make every effort to contact subjects of a story and provide them with an opportunity to comment. You've probably seen this in stories that you've read before, but anytime you are reporting on something where there are multiple stakeholders, you need to make sure that you reach out to every side. Even if they don't respond, you need to say that in your article to show that you have done your due diligence as a reporter. Anytime you've seen in an article something like so-and-so declined to comment, or so-and-so declined to speak on the record, or so-and-so did not respond to a request for an interview, the reason that's in there is because it's your job as a reporter to let your audience know that you did reach out to this person because you care about getting the full story. If they don't respond back to you, then that's their issue, but you need to tell your readers that you did reach out, because that's what good reporters do. Also, make sure that you label opinion and editorial content. We have both on our website. We have news, we have features, sports, but we also have opinion. And there is a big difference between opinion content and news content. In a perfect world, those on a publication are completely separate. In most professional publications, like the New York Times, for example, anybody who works on the opinion section of the website has nothing to do with the news section of the website to keep that bias separate. So make sure that anytime something is opinionated, you clearly label it so that people don't accuse you of being biased in content that's meant to be unbiased. Also, back to conflicts of interest. Avoid conflicts of interest when possible. So what that looks like in a school setting is if you are an athlete on the football team, you cannot write a story about football. If you are a member of Oats, you cannot write a story about Oats. If you are a member of a group that is the subject of a story, you cannot report on it. That is called a conflict of interest, and it is a huge no-no. The reason for that is it's going to be near impossible for you to be objective if you are reporting on something that you have a personal stake in. Now, sometimes maybe you're not super involved with that thing, and it would be possible for you to report on it unbiased. But your audience isn't going to see that. Your audience is going to see that you have that personal connection. They're automatically going to assume that your bias exists, and they're going to have one more reason not to listen to you as a reporter. And trust me, now that you're a member of the media, people are always looking for reasons not to listen to you. So, conflict of interest, huge thing. Do not do it. Also, don't jump to conclusions. Make sure that you are confirming everything when you report. You don't want to make assumptions based on one vague thing that one source says. You need to get that confirmation from multiple sources. Otherwise, you run the risk of running fake news, which is incredibly irresponsible, and you never want to be in that situation as a journalist. More on conflict of interest. So, like I said, reporting on a group or a team that you're a part of is an example of a conflict of interest, but these are also examples of conflicts of interest. Accepting gifts from story subjects. If you're interviewing someone and they offer you a gift, you can't take it. You just can't. And sometimes it might be innocuous. They're not necessarily trying to influence you. For example, let's say that you're interviewing a teacher or an administrator and they offer to buy you lunch. You can't take that. That is a gift. You do not want any monetary influence in your story. So just don't do it. Kindly explain to them that you would take the gift, but it's unethical. Thank them for offering, but do not take it. Also, personal relationships with story subjects. If you're dating someone, for example, and they're the center of an important story, you should not report on it. Or a vested interest or bias in a topic or event. If you already know that you have a super strong opinion about a story that you're reporting on, get someone else to report it, just in case. If any of these apply to you, don't report on the story. Let someone else take it. Next up is be honest. It sounds pretty simple, but like all of these, there are more components that go into it. First of all, don't plagiarize. Hopefully we all know that by now, but in this class it is especially important because if you plagiarize, you can get into legal trouble because you're not just turning something into me, you're publishing something online. Also, don't mix fact and fiction. If you use fabrication as a narrative device, so for example, a hypothetical in a story, be very careful to ensure that you are clarifying what is fact and what is hypothetical. People are a lot worse at differentiating between the two than you would think. Also, don't misrepresent yourself when you're reporting. You're a reporter. You want to avoid what we call gotcha journalism. Don't pretend, for example, that you're just having a normal conversation with a source and then have them read about themselves in 4250 a week later if they never knew you were a journalist. That's one of the reasons why anytime you interview someone for this class, you need to start by introducing yourself and saying that you are a reporter from 4250. It is incredibly unethical to do otherwise. Also, don't tolerate dishonesty from fellow reporters. Hold your classmates accountable, because ultimately, people are going to look at your publication's name before they look at your byline. And if you are a reflection of your publication, then your classmates sure as heck are as well. So make sure you're holding your classmates accountable and fact-checking them too. Always stand by promises, including promises of source anonymity. We will talk more about source anonymity later because that's a very complicated topic. But in the unlikely event that you interview someone and they say that you can only quote them because they are anonymous, you must keep that promise. You cannot name them later. You can't name them to me. You can't name them to an administrator. The only people who should know the name of your anonymous source are you and your editor. And we will talk more about that soon. Also, be very careful when evaluating a source's validity. We talked about that in class today, but make sure that you are evaluating whether or not the person you are talking to knows what they're talking about, if they have the necessary expertise, and also what their bias is. Because often people will want to talk to reporters and have interviews with reporters because they are furthering their own agenda. So make sure you're aware of that too. And be very careful with satire. We'll talk about satire in April when we do our April Fool's issue, but satire always has to be clearly labeled. Also, don't alter digital content like photos, aside from minor lighting enhancements. So no crazy Photoshop stuff, no like teeth whitening or whatever, and don't pose photos. There are some exceptions to this, but in general, don't pose photos. If you do either for an artistic purpose, so in other words, graphics or illustrations, then they have to be labeled as graphics or photo illustrations. But if you are presenting something as photojournalism or as a candid photo, it must be truly candid. Also, always get permission before recording a conversation. That is not just ethical, but in the state of Illinois, that is required by law. We are a two-party consent state, meaning that in order to record someone and use it later in either a court or in a story, you must have the consent of all parties being recorded. It is illegal otherwise. So always notify your subject that you are recording. And do not lie. Hopefully I don't need to expound on that further. So let's talk more about source anonymity because this is such a complicated topic. So if you promise a source anonymity, and what that means, by the way, is let's say that you're interviewing a source and they say, I can tell you this information, you can use it, but you can't quote me by name. So if you agree to that, which you almost never should, and we'll talk about when and when not to do that, if you agree to it, you cannot go back on that promise, no matter what. Be very careful then about agreeing to source anonymity. There are some instances where anonymity may be appropriate. An interview, for example, with a sexual assault survivor. That is an example where, yes, an anonymous source would make sense, especially if that person is currently undergoing court proceedings. Or an interview with someone who offers valuable and confirmed perspectives or information that can't be gained from another named source. Whenever possible, you want to find a source that will name themselves. But if you can't find that information from any other source and that person is insisting on being anonymous, then maybe you're justified in keeping them anonymous. But if you do grant anonymity, regardless of the situation, you need to triple check the information that your anonymous source gives you. Ultimately, if your source is remaining anonymous, they're not attaching a name to what they're saying. So if what they're saying is wrong, they're not getting any blowback from that. You and your publication are. It's your job as a reporter to make sure that you are verifying the information your anonymous source gives you with at least 2 other sources, preferably named sources. And if you do grant anonymity, only disclose the name of your source to your editor and whoever else is working on the story. Do not disclose the name of your source to me. As an educator in public education, I am what is known as a mandatory reporter. If you end up reporting on something involving students getting harmed or students doing anything illegal, and you tell me who your anonymous source is, I have to tell the police and administration. You do not. So do not share your source with me. Share it with your editor and whoever else is working on the story. Fourth is be accurate. So what this looks like is accuracy first and foremost, is getting facts right and putting them together in a way that reveals accurate and clear context. That's ultimately what a reporter does. You're getting facts together and you're presenting them to people in a way that is easy to understand. So you want to have first-hand witnesses whenever possible to make sure that you are as accurate as possible. Don't take someone's official statement as the only truth. So what that means, especially if you are interviewing people at district, is keep in mind that official statements put out by public relations people are always going to be crafted to make whatever organization they're representing look good. Doesn't mean that that is always 100% the truth. So try to get first-hand accounts. People lie. Breaking news. Also, have several people review a story before publishing to ensure that it's not misleading. Lucky for you, you don't have a choice there. You're going to have at least 3 pairs of eyes on your story before it gets published. Know your subject's source credibility and double check your information, of course. Just because your subject says something, if it's wrong, you can still be held accountable for it if you publish it. So make sure you're fact checking what your subjects say. Be willing to read back quotes to ensure accuracy. That goes for before you write your article. So if you are interviewing someone and you want to make sure that you got a quote right, read it back to them to confirm it. But later, if you write your article and the person requests to see the quotes that you are using in your article, say no. That is something called prior review, and it is not ethical. Be very wary of questionnaires and surveys. We can talk more about that, but there's a lot of other stuff that goes into questionnaires and surveys that involves bias as well. Tell what you know, but also admit what you don't know as a reporter. That's also very important. Sometimes you are not going to be able to get the whole story by the time it's time to print your story, so make sure that you acknowledge what information is still missing so that you can update later. And fact check. Fact check. Fact check. Fact check. And number 5 is be independent. This one's fun. So what this means is that you are a news organization. You're not a public relations firm meant to make the school and the administration look good. As journalists, your job is to report on the true stories, even if those true stories are not always positive. Still, you want to show your administrators through good and thorough reporting why having an independent student media organization is a benefit to the school and not a drawback. You're not there to make the school look good. You're there to present information. But you want to make sure that, especially when you're reporting on things that might not make the school look good, you are being thorough and responsible so no one has any room to criticize you for things that they should be criticizing you for. Resist prior review. We'll be talking more about that in a second because that's really important. You also do not have any obligation to news sources or news makers as a journalist, so avoid even the appearance of conflict of interest, which we already talked about. Do not accept gifts, disclose conflicts of interest, we talked about that. Know your rights. As a student journalist in the state of Illinois, writing for a student publication at a public high school, you have the same First Amendment rights as an adult. Point blank. Know that and don't let anybody try to tell you otherwise. Hold those in power accountable, which we also already talked about. Don't pull favors for groups or advertisers. Keep news and editorial separate. A lot of this is repetitive, but it's because it's so important. So let's talk about prior review and prior restraint, because this is the part of this that is most relevant to student journalists. So prior review is when someone who is not on the publication staff reviews content before it is published. So most often, an example of this would be an interview subject or an administrator, like a principal. Prior restraint is when someone who is not on the publication staff reviews content and requires it to be changed in some way before publishing or prevents its publication altogether. Prior restraint, in most situations, is illegal. Prior review is not illegal, but is strongly discouraged, and in practice, we do not have prior review on our publication. Let's keep it that way. So, we avoid prior review. Prior restraint, in the event of prior review, is pretty much illegal. We'll talk about that more in a future lesson because that can get a little complicated too. But ultimately, to remain an independent publication, nobody outside of the publication should review what you write before it is published. The only exception to that so far in practice is me, because I am not a part of the publication. I'm your teacher. But up until this point, I have read most of your stuff before you publish it in order to make sure it's good. But if you want to change that in the future, that's your prerogative, because ultimately it's your publication and you make the decisions, not me. So like I said, you want to avoid prior review at all costs. It's not beneficial to your story and it can affect your story's integrity. So various forms of prior review involve the outright prior review. So an example of that would be an administrator or principal has to review and okay all content before publication. A source or anyone else not on the publication asking to see a story before it's published, that is prior review. And sometimes people will just do that out of practice, but you always have to explain, no, I'm sorry, I can't show you the story before it's published. However, this is the date that it's being published, and I will send you a copy of the story once it is published. Or 3, a source asking to see what quotes of theirs will be used in a story before it is published. That is technically also a form of prior review. If someone asks for that, just reassure them that you recorded the conversation, and you can assure them that anytime they're quoted in the article, it will be 100% accurate to what they said. And again, once the article is published, send it to them. And 6, this is the one that you really want to go to anytime you have any ethical questions in journalism, is minimize harm. Basically, think about the consequences that your story is going to have after it's published, which we already touched on. Will it minimize harm to your audience or maximize it? This, above all else, should guide your publishing decisions. Sometimes you might have confirmed true information, but ultimately, if that information is not going to benefit the public and it's actually going to harm it, then maybe it's not something you should put out. Immediately, especially as student journalists, immediately report to school authorities anybody who threatens their own safety or the safety of others. For example, if you find out that a student is planning a school shooting, yeah, that's a juicy story and you could report on it for 4250, but you shouldn't. Not before notifying police. Always make sure that you are going through the systems in place first, and then if the systems are broken, hold them accountable. But those systems do exist for a reason, and you do need to make sure that you are protecting people as a person before you are reporting on things as a journalist. And do not put yourself or other student reporters in legal or physical danger just to get a story. You're not getting paid for this, all right? So calm down a little bit. Also, know that you're reporting on young people. Protect young sources from their own lack of judgment with unwise quotes, etc. We've had instances where someone's been quoted and they've said a swear word if they said something offensive. And generally the best thing to do in that situation is to just leave the quote out. Because ultimately, most of the people you're interviewing are minors. You don't want to ruin someone's life because they had a momentary lapse of judgment when you were interviewing them. Also, keep in mind that everything is going to be searchable online. So just one off quote from someone actually can ruin their life and ruin their chances of getting a job in the future. So look out for them too. Show respect and compassion also for students who might be affected by your coverage, especially if you're reporting on something sensitive. You want to get the story, but you also, again, want to recognize the humanity of people. And be sensitive when covering sensitive stories. We'll talk more about how to do that because it can be very tricky. Making sure that you are being pushy enough to get an important story out there, but not being so pushy that your interview subject feels like they're being exploited. Because you don't want to exploit people. Ultimately, the purpose of good journalism is to help people. And you want to balance the public's right to be informed with the private citizen's right to privacy. So that goes back to our news values and determining whether or not a story is actually newsworthy. Think back to prominence. If a student gets a DUI, for example, yeah, you could report on it, but is it actually going to do any good for the community? Is it actually necessary information to put out there for the public? Probably not. And also understand and respect different privacy expectations for private citizens versus public citizens. That also goes into provenance. And when I talk about public citizens, I, in a school context, generally mean people who work for the school district. Because if a teacher has a DUI, that's a much different story, and maybe that would be worth reporting on versus a student. And also, when covering criminal activity, avoid naming minors for legal reasons. And the last one is be accountable. So anytime you make a mistake, which hopefully won't happen, but sometimes it does happen, even to professional publications, you need to admit your mistake and publish a labeled correction as soon as the mistake is brought to your attention. You also want to expose unethical practices of other student journalists and remedy them, so like I said, holding your classmates accountable. Only use press passes for journalistic purposes. When we go back in person, you will get press passes that will allow you entrance into certain events in the school for free, and it will allow you to go places in the school that you would normally require a class pass for, but make sure that you are using it only for journalistic purposes, because if I find out that you aren't, I will revoke your press pass privileges, and it will be very difficult for you to do anything for this class, but that'll be your problem. Record all interviews and take detailed notes. Keep recordings and notes indefinitely. Do not delete them. You never know when you might need something. Accept and allow avenues of feedback for your publication. Welcome and publish criticism, which we do. We have a comment section. We don't delete any comments unless they are inflammatory or illegal. And we also allow for letters to the editor, and we publish all of those. Be prepared to justify and explain your reasons for your stories and coverage. Because ultimately, if you report on something controversial, it's going to be controversial because you're doing it, not because I'm doing it. So you need to be prepared to defend why you are reporting on what you're reporting on. And, of course, be cautious about using anonymous sources. So, that's the NSPA Code of Ethics. I know it's a lot, but it will be beaten into you throughout the year and any subsequent years that you are in the journalism program. It's extremely important to be ethical in your reporting because ultimately a good journalist is an ethical journalist.